They ignored the trials showing the low-fat diet didn't work. They ignored the trials showing that replacing saturated fat with unsaturated vegetable oils did not have any effect on reducing heart disease or cardiovascular mortality. And that's the way they arrive at the conclusions that they do, only by ignoring the evidence. And then they produce these guidelines that are truly not evidence-based by any conventional definition of that word. There are multiple randomized controlled clinical trials showing that people can reverse their type 2 diabetes, obesity, and other conditions within weeks, really, by going on a very low carbohydrate diet or ketogenic diet. Pharmaceutical companies fund a lot of nutrition researchers, and they may do this because they have like a product, like a formula-based diet that they want to promote, but they also have an interest in dietary recommendations that produce human beings who are not healthy and who then need their pharmaceutical products. There was a great Lancet editorial on this where they basically said, the science is completely being ignored on sodium. It's just a wild ride out there in the world of what you think is nutrition science.
Nina, if you were given total control over the current dietary guidelines, what would our new MyPlate look like?
So we have the food pyramid. I mean, that's the last, right? We do have MyPlate, but really, I think the food pyramid is the one that people most still relate to because MyPlate is such a vague kindergarten graphic. Okay, here's what we would need to do to change dietary guidelines. So currently, there are 3 dietary patterns that are offered by the guidelines. The guidelines are put out by the USDA and HHS, U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. They're reissued every 5 years. We have a new one coming up. I think they're the single most powerful lever on what Americans think is a healthy diet, what they choose to eat, and what they are fed critically, because the guidelines controls what's in school lunches for kids, what's in feeding programs for the elderly, what the military is advised to eat. The military, which, by the way, has an obesity problem equal to the regular population, despite all the physical fitness requirements. So this policy is just vastly influential. And fundamentally, it lacks an option for people with diet-related chronic diseases. The policy was formed to prevent disease, which it obviously hasn't done since it was launched in 1980. The rates of obesity and other chronic diseases have turned sharply upwards. But the population was more healthy then. Now the population, by one estimate, 93% of American adults have one or more chronic diseases. And so this policy is a complete misfit for the population it's supposed to serve. So fundamentally, there needs to be a dietary pattern for people with metabolic and chronic diseases. So that's not required for everyone, but if you have one of these conditions, there should be an option for you. That pattern would probably be a very low carbohydrate diet because that's where the evidence is. I mean, there are multiple randomized controlled clinical trials showing that people can reverse their type 2 diabetes, obesity, and other conditions within weeks, really, by going on a very low carbohydrate diet or ketogenic diet. So that's where the evidence is. The only other ways to reverse type 2 diabetes that are also evidence-based is a very low calorie, like 850 calories a day, which is not really sustainable, all formula-based for most of that time, although they allow foods to be reintroduced. That's not a sustainable nor a natural diet. And the only other way that's been shown to reverse type 2 diabetes is bariatric surgery. So if we're looking for a whole foods nutritional approach, it would be a very low carb diet. And that should be one offering in the dietary guidelines for people with these diseases. The other changes that have to happen to the guidelines to make them evidence-based, that means reflect the best and most current science, are eliminate the cap on saturated fat, which was never based on good evidence and has subsequently, there are more than 24 systematic review papers showing that the evidence is lacking for a continued cap on those fats. So currently it's 10% of calories. That's the limit. That has to be eliminated, that cap. Stop telling people to eat 5.5 teaspoons a day of seed oils, because seed oils, although they do lower LDL cholesterol, have all sorts of problems with oxidation, inflammation, cancer, which we can discuss. Also, you would have to get rid of this notion that lower is better on sodium. It turns out that a moderate amount of sodium is where you see the most cardiovascular benefits. And so the lower is better, especially for kids for whom there's no data at all. That should be eliminated. I think if you did those basic changes, you would start to have guidelines that could reverse chronic disease in America.
All right, well, let's take some time and go through each of these. There's a lot of good, valid points here. Starting with the first one you brought up, which is going lower carb. So this is still within a spectrum, going all the way down to carnivore. You could do, ketogenic, having a little bit more carbs, being still on that end of the low carb spectrum. How far does somebody need to go? I assume it's dependent on the person, but if we're going to make this a really general recommendation and make it easy for people to follow, where would you put that target?
The formal definition that has been largely agreed upon by the experts in the field is 100 grams maximum of carbohydrate, which is roughly 25% of calories in an average adult's diet. That's low carbohydrate. I think that a low carbohydrate option should be offered, but it should be possible to go lower if you want. A ketogenic diet is 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates a day, according to the most agreed upon definition. Or you can go lower than that. I mean, I think that the randomized controlled trials are not yet there for zero carb or carnivore, but there's evidence to show that those are safe and effective strategies. I think that if you can just allow people to say, like, low carb this is the maximum 100 grams, and you can go lower than that, that would work. I should also say that, the guidelines now, all of its patterns include more than 50% of calories as carbohydrates. That's what they're currently offering. That is a high carbohydrate diet. It's six servings of grains a day, including 3 servings of refined grains, which is insane. So, even in these other patterns, I think the 6 servings of grains per day should be lower.
You mentioned the fact that every 5 years we get new guidelines and we're due for some new ones coming down the pipe. Any hope for lower carb being part of that?
No.
And I'm assuming it's going to be, okay, no.
No.
I assume it would be slow jumps. If it wouldn't just be a drastic thing, but are we at least starting to head in that direction?
It's a pretty sad story, what has happened with the low carb diet at the USDA. I'll just give you a little hint of it because I did a bunch of reporting on it, including filing Freedom of Information Act requests, which is you can get emails. And I found out that back in 2015, they did a hidden review of low carbohydrate diets. And there was an email conversation that went on that was like, hey, these diets seem to do better than any other diet, and we're going to be asked about them. And then they effectively buried that evidence in sort of not in the results section of the scientific report. So it wasn't, it was in like a different section, the methodology section, where it was not considered. And one of the expert panel members, Frank Hu of Harvard, he speaks up and he says, we shouldn't be burying the evidence like this. And then the conversation goes silent. That was 2015. In 2020, we actually, because this group that I founded called the Nutrition Coalition, we brought dozens of people, many, many doctors, to testify at the Dietary Guideline Committee hearing meetings in DC and outside of DC. That's back when they accepted public testimony, which they don't really do anymore, in person. We got the expert committee to review low carb diets, and we got them to define them correctly as 25% of calories as being a low carb. That was the definition they used. They could not find a single study for low carb diets. I mean, they said, we can't find any We understand this is a popular diet, but we can't find any studies. This was at a time when there were already hundreds of clinical trials. The USDA itself had, in the last go around of the guidelines, had itself found 43 studies, but now they couldn't find any. And one of the members of the expert committee was actually the lead author on an important low carb study, and that trial wasn't included either. They couldn't even find her trial, and she didn't speak up about it. So, and this go around, the current iteration, they're not looking at any clinical trials on low carb. They're doing some computer modeling around low carb, which is an incredibly weak and hypothetical form of evidence. They're not looking at the most rigorous evidence. And that avoidance of clinical trials that has been typical throughout the history of the guidelines, where they rely on weak studies, now computer modeling, and previously it's just they rely on these epidemiological studies that can show associations but not cause and effect. They really have ignored nearly all the large NIH-funded clinical trials that have been conducted. They ignored the trials showing the low-fat diet didn't work. They ignored the trials showing that replacing saturated fat with unsaturated vegetable oils, that did not have any effect on reducing heart disease or cardiovascular mortality. So all those trials have been ignored. And that's the way they arrive at the conclusions that they do. It's, only by ignoring the evidence, and then they produce these guidelines that are truly not evidence-based by any conventional definition of that word.
The question comes up, how do they get away with this? They're burying good evidence, ignoring things. Obviously, our current model isn't working with that number of 90+% right now being metabolically unhealthy. How come people aren't taking to the streets and pushing back?
Well, because, I've been the principal person leading that charge with the Nutrition Coalition. We have done letter writing campaigns. We had social media campaigns. We had people calling their congressmen. We've written had lots and lots of people submit comments, write reviews. We've had articles in the media. And this is not only happening in nutrition, but in other areas of science. We cannot penetrate what is a broad consensus in the media and among experts in the field to defend the existing policy. That's just there. It is all sewn up. And they're the people, the academics in the field with whom I've published papers, some top people, including former dietary guideline committee members. These people tend to be, in order to speak out, they have to be near retirement or retired, because nutrition scientists themselves cannot speak out because they will lose funding. I have interviewed scientists for whom this has happened. They will lose funding. They will be disinvited from conferences, or they will no longer be able to participate in their field if they raise their voices. And so the field itself can't police itself. And the influence of the government funding for nutrition research, that has a huge effect on the community of researchers out there. They can't get funding if they're going to step out of line and criticize the government's nutrition policy. So, it's extremely problematic that the government issues these guidelines, because there's such there's such a conflict of interest. They're issuing all the research funding, and the research funding has to go into supporting their preferred diet. And this has been true. This was going on in the 60s and 70s, when the National Institutes of Health adopted the whole idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol caused heart disease. And people who spoke out, and there were more of them then, they would, I interviewed one scientist who was quite well known, George Mann, and he was told by a secretary at NIH, if you continue your opposition to this hypothesis effectively, we're going to cut your research grant. And he lost his grant. So that's the reality for people in the field. And that's why there are so few people speaking up. And it really takes outsiders like myself who don't mind the slings and arrows to write about it and speak about it. But it's very hard to find allies. There also are no business interests. There are few business interests behind a whole foods natural diet, and without money, without an industry alignment, it's very hard to create awareness around an issue. You need the kind of funding that our movement just has never had to date.
Okay, so what's the answer? You're somebody that's been opposed to this and speaking out against it.
Yeah.
Has there been any increase in awareness because of that? And then number two, given the fall on deaf ears to this point, any new ideas or strategies of how this can penetrate even deeper?
Yeah. I mean, I've returned to journalism and no longer really doing advocacy work. When I was doing it, I was quoted and cited in every major newspaper. My work has appeared all over the place. We were consulted. We were sort of the opposing voice in every story that came out on the guidelines. And I think we definitely raised awareness. I mean, just the fact that your first question to me was about the guidelines, nobody even knew how powerful the guidelines were, right? Or how important they were until I started this work. Or I should say, very few people did. And I think it's now there's a much greater understanding about the importance of this policy. I see some hope now in the attention to chronic disease that RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again movement has brought to these issues, although their solutions do not yet involve changing the guidelines. They're focused on a bunch of things that are probably good, like get food dyes out of cereals, but it's still bad to feed your kids cereal for breakfast. So I don't think that those policies will reverse chronic disease, which is what RFK Jr. has said he and pledged to do if he were, well, back when he was a presidential candidate. But I do see hope in the greater attention to these issues that has happened in the past, 6 months or so. And I just think there is much more awareness out there now about low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets. I mean, there's a lot happening in the mental health space due to Metabolic Mind and the Bazuki group. And there are other things happening, and sort of, more people are waking up. And it may be that I think do have hope for significant change. I think we need professional advocates in this space. It's been a space that has grown up in a grassroots way with journalists, doctors, academics, everyday people restoring their health. And it just has not found people who are professional Washington, D.C. dwellers who know how to work that system. But I do think there are those people on the horizon.
So coming back to our first recommendation, going lower carb, good news in this is it's a very low risk thing for people to try out. When it comes to the other two macros, fats and protein, we have essential amino acids and we have essential fatty acids. When it comes to carbs, there's no requirement for them. So people can be a bit more lax about experimenting in that realm.
Well, I mean, you and I understand that, and probably a lot of your listeners do, but there is still a myth out there that your brain requires glucose to function, that you need carbs for energy, that's your primary fuel source. That is not based in science, but it's still, I think, a prevalent belief.
Well, let's get into what's happening in the body if somebody isn't taking this recommendation to heart and applying it, and they're consuming a lot of carbs, a lot of sugar. Let's talk about insulin resistance all the way down to type 2 diabetes, where somebody is pushing it in that realm for years, maybe not noticing a whole lot of change in their health at that point, but what's happening in the body?
If you're on a very low carbohydrate diet?
No, if you're on a high carb and you're ignoring what we're talking about and the blood glucose is going up and insulin and the whole insulin resistance story, that leads to that 90+% of people that are metabolically unhealthy.
Yes, the best person I think to talk on this is Dr. Ben Bickman, and I think he does a great job of describing it. But I put it in very simple terms, which is that when you eat carbohydrates, you're including, whole grain, what seem to be good, healthy whole grains. Your body, as soon as you eat them, that becomes glucose and fructose in your body. But let's just talk about what happens to the glucose. The glucose, your body doesn't want any more than about a teaspoon of glucose at any one time, and it doesn't want. It wants to bring down your blood sugars and bring them back into a normal range. When glucose hits your system, your blood sugar goes up. It spikes. And so the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin, its main job is to take the glucose and deliver it into one of the tissues in your body. So it will do that with your muscle, and the muscle cells will you will actually maybe be inspired to move because you've suddenly got energy in your muscle. It will go into the liver, and it will go into the fat cells. So, and of those tissues, the one tissue that it has an unlimited capacity to store glucose is your fat cells. So you will, when you have an abundance of, when you are constantly eating carbs, chronically, morning, noon, and night, and your body is constantly being subjected to these pumps of insulin, the glucose will be start to just only be stored in the fat cells. That's people getting fat. And there are different phenotypes for this. I mean, it's a known phenotype in Asian cultures that they do not deposit as much of the glucose in their fat cells. They can stay thin while becoming insulin resistant. So what is insulin resistance is, over time, you need more and more insulin to deal with the glucose. Your insulin rises over time. That insulin rise happens way before, years before, you start to see a gradual increase in your average blood sugars. It's the average blood sugars that eventually get measured and diagnosed as you're being somebody with prediabetes or diabetes. But long before that, your insulin has started to ramp up more and more to deal with all of this glucose. It needs more insulin. It's not as effective. The receptors on your tissues are having more and more trouble taking in all the glucose and storing it. So over time, your body can no longer process all that glucose. And that is when you develop insulin resistance. And that can happen long before you're diagnosed with any kind of elevated blood sugars called HbA1c, which is what the formal diagnosis, that's what the formal diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, that is when it gets up to a certain level, 6.5%. So, and that condition of being insulin resistant is the root cause, not just of diabetes, and also, as you can see, of obesity, but also, as we've learned, many other, or maybe all other, diet-related chronic diseases.
And tying this to what we've talked about so far, the current recommendations, as you mentioned, is it 50% carbs? That's the current recommendation?
More than 50%. It's like 52 to 54%.
Right. So this is going to continually raise blood sugar, spike insulin as well, and lead us down this path that you just described.
Correct. I mean, I think there's enough evidence to show that our dietary guidelines very likely caused the epidemics of obesity and diabetes that we're now experiencing. If you look at obesity rates in the United States, they're going on, they're pretty moderate. And until 1980, that's the year that the dietary guidelines are launched, wherein the recommendation at the time was 10 slices of bread a day. I mean, the very first dietary guidelines were at least 10 servings of grains a day. And you see the obesity curve just sharply turning upwards and going up ever since. And actually, the government has stopped measuring obesity rates. They did that in 2016 at that time, it was nearly 43%. They have not since released any obesity rate numbers. And I imagine we're far above 50% now.
Any reason they're not doing that? Are they just afraid of scaring people?
I think the government, from everything I've learned in all of my research over the years, they really don't want information that reflects poorly upon them. And I've seen this over the years. I've seen information disappear. I've seen even the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive rubbed of information that previously, they now find embarrassing. I mean, it's really not. I don't think we're getting good information from the NIH, USDA, CDC, other public agencies.
So what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like two different factors are a big part of putting the brake on change here. One being this embarrassment factor and having to take back their words. And then obviously a big part of it is the money.
Yeah. So let's talk a little about the money. So the Nutrition Coalition was we sponsored and we started the first ever systematic review of all the conflicts of interest on a dietary guideline advisory committee. Nobody had done this before. So we did this for the 2020 committee. We discovered that 95% of this 20-person committee had at least one tie with food or pharma, and more than half of the committee had 30 such ties or more. One member of the committee had 152 ties. And it's with not just food, but you have to, pharma, I didn't understand this when I first started my research. Pharmaceutical companies fund a lot of nutrition researchers. And they may do this because they have like a product, like a formula-based diet that they want to promote. But they also have an interest in dietary recommendations that produce human beings who are not healthy and who then need their pharmaceutical products. So that seems really quite cynical, but I just don't think you can underestimate their way that they promote their products. And that's one of them. The companies that were most frequently mentioned as having ties with the Dietary Guideline Committee were like Kellogg's, Unilever, Nestle, Dannon. They're also the ones that have the most influence in global food policy, and Coke, Pepsi, and also a group called ILSI, ILSI, which is like the International Life Sciences Institute, which is also, although they call themselves a nonprofit, they're really an interest group for large multinational food corporations. So, and are hugely influential. So we also found another piece of work we did at the Nutrition Coalition is that the very office that runs the dietary guidelines within USDA, that little office has more than 100 formal partnerships with food companies. So, they meet monthly. I don't know what they talk about, but they're working with food companies. And, part of the issue we see here is an inherent problem in the USDA, which was known from the very start of the guidelines, which is that they're an agency that is supposed to promote American farm products. They're supposed to promote various food products. I don't think they were ever intended to promote multinational food corporations, but they are now effectively doing that. But they also have a conflicting mission in the guidelines to tell people to eat less of this and more of that. So they have to pick and choose their industries. And they're just inherently conflicted in those dual missions.
One thing we're quickly noticing here as we get into the weeds is that with the amount of corruption, dirty money, so much behind the scenes that we probably only know a certain percentage of, to me, it's like, okay, given all this, we got to go grassroots. Trying to police different people and investigate and trying to get all these different groups to participate and abide by the rules seems, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, helpless. We need to go grassroots and work from the bottom up.
I'm really sympathetic to that argument, but I get stuck at the point at which every single federal agency is required by law to follow the guidelines. So even if we fix our own, the food in our own households and our families, what about what kids are getting fed at school? And what about poor kids? What about when people in nursing homes? What about all the cafeteria food people eat? What about people in the military being told, eat spaghetti and avoid meat? I mean, there's just so many people. I mean, like 1 in 4 Americans eats a government funded meal a day, women and infant children. There's currently almost no protein in those meals they give infant children and women. There are too many people left out of the solution if you ignore the guidelines. That's my problem with it.
I hear you. I agree with you. It's a great point. But let's caveat what I said then. Grassroots making change starting there and then trickling out to impact guidelines.
Well, that's essentially what we tried to do, which was to organize people to impact this policy. I think you could do it. You just need a lot more money behind that issue. Or you need leadership. You need, let's just say if Trump were elected and they decided to reform this policy, that might work. Potentially.
We definitely need to do something different. Apparently nothing we're doing right now is working.
Well, I mean, it's just that there is this huge impediment, which is this giant government policy that is so wrong. I mean, do you know that it is illegal to even give away whole milk on school grounds? You have to give it away in a parking lot across the street or something. You can't even give away whole milk to kids. That's how tough it is. That's how, even these dairy farmers who want to give away their milk to children are not allowed to do that.
Since we're talking about going grassroots and building up from there, anything within that policy worthy at this point that we can keep?
No.
Have they gotten anything right?
No. I mean, not really. I can't even think of a single thing. It's lean meat, low-fat dairy, huge emphasis on fruits and vegetables. They don't distinguish between fruits and vegetables. They're all the same for them. Emphasis on in the protein category, which has been eroded, and in the new guidelines is likely further to be eroded, shifting from animal source proteins to beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds. So switching over to incomplete proteins that are less easily absorbed by humans to use for muscle growth and repair. Yeah, I can't think of anything. Sorry.
Okay. When do the new guidelines come out?
It should be by the end of this year or early next year. Usually they like to drop them like in the dead spot between Christmas and New Year's, but they're not seeking a lot of attention.
So let's come back to the insulin resistance story. You explained it, gave us a general overview, which was great. Good news in this, when we start to make the changes that you talked about in the beginning, including the low carb piece, we can reverse this. So it's not all hope is lost. It's just getting the information to people and giving them the education, the hope, and then allowing them to work back.
Yeah, I think, it's not hard to educate people. I mean, recently I wrote a piece for Medscape in which I went and interviewed people in the South Bronx, which is the poorest part of New York City. And there's a fantastic endocrinologist named Mariella Glant who's been working there. And she has an app, phone app, and some health coaches who help her. But she has been able to reverse type 2 diabetes in a population that is poor, can't afford a lot. We're typically told you can't teach these people, they can't afford the diet, and yet she's had stunning success. I interviewed a woman who lives in a homeless shelter who's managed to reverse a bunch of conditions using a low carbohydrate diet. So I don't think it's so complicated. I think you just have to teach people which foods have carbohydrates in them. Don't fear fat, prioritize protein, and the people who we think are least capable and able to adopt this approach, it seems that they can, which is really encouraging.
Let's talk about the protein piece. You just mentioned prioritizing that. Somebody who right now is just eating, say, what they consider healthy, but not cognizant of their different macros and how much of each they're getting, how do they go about allocating? And we talked about carbs, but when it comes to, we'll specifically focus on protein right now.
Yeah. I'm not like a particular protein expert. So I would say 30 to 35 grams per meal is a decent amount. That's like, it's like that much steak or um, uh, um, a few eggs. Like it's just important that be, and it's super important also to have that with fat. So not lean protein and, eggs cooked in butter and maybe add some cream. You need to have the fat. A ketogenic diet is formally not a low, it's not a high protein diet. It's a high fat diet, and you need the fat to process the protein. And I say prioritize protein as a way for people to understand when they're eating their meal, they need that needs to be the first thing they eat, the first thing on their plate. And that will, in part because like that is really what provides satiety to people. That's what fills people up, and therefore they are no longer hungry. Then if you're somebody who's still addicted to carbohydrates, you aren't as hungry for them. So you still, if you still include them in your diet, you have them at the end of the meal. But if you eat your protein first, it's what I tell my kids, like, okay, I'm not going to police you, but like just eat your protein first in a meal, and then it makes management of the rest of your diet a lot more easy.
All right. For somebody who's going to take these guidelines and begin to apply them, let's address a couple of the concerns that might come up. So, somebody prioritizing protein, cutting down on carbs, might say to themselves, okay, carbs are where I get my fiber. And I've always been told fiber is so important. How do you look at fiber?
Well, fiber is a carbohydrate. So by definition, it is non-essential. That's kind of the long and short of it. And we've come to believe that fiber is essential for digestion. And that may be true on a high carbohydrate diet, but it turns out not to be true on a low carbohydrate diet. And if you look at systematic reviews, does fiber help prevent heart disease? No. Does it help with IBS conditions or IBD, irritable bowel disease? And the answer there is no. Actually, they recently did a study where they compared a FODMAP diet, which is the standard in the field, with a ketogenic diet, and the ketogenic diet did better in terms of reducing symptoms of IBS, IBD. The one study that's been done on constipation, the best diet they had medium, moderate, high carbohydrate diet, low carbohydrate diet. The low carbohydrate diet did the very best in that clinical trial. That's just one experiment. But on a low carbohydrate diet, there's no fiber requirement. However, if people want to consume fiber, they feel like that's still important, or they don't feel comfortable abandoning it, that's perfectly possible to get all the fiber that you need from the vegetables that you're eating.
Well, a big push from a lot of the people in the higher carb, more plant based diet is to eat a diverse array of different fruits and vegetables, different colors,
Yeah.
for the purpose of feeding the microbiome. So let's bring the microbiome into this.
There's just no evidence to support that contention. The microbiome is a big black box, and it's become a hot topic area for people to research. But all we really know is that when you have a problem with your microbiome, you get one of these IBD conditions. That's the outcome. So all we really know is what's the evidence showing how to reverse those symptoms. And so, the theory is that starches and sugars, they break down the lining between the gut and the circulatory system, and therefore you have what's called a leaky gut. And also the theory, I'm not an expert in this area, so I can't really, but I know the theory is that also that the foods that protect and build that gut lining are whole foods, preferably animal sourced. There's the Weston A. Price Foundation. They really believe that uh, pickled vegetables help restore the gut lining. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I mainly look at clinical trial evidence to say, well, what's the hard evidence for what we can say? And what what I see in this space so far is that there really is no evidence for a high fiber diet protecting against conditions. And this clinical trial I told you about was the first time that looked at a ketogenic diet that did very well.
Let's bring saturated fat back into it. And I think before you said the current guidelines cap that at around 10%. For somebody who begins to lower the carbs, include more animal protein in their diet, they're naturally going to begin to consume more saturated fat. So let's talk about why we're fearing it, and then if there's any validity there.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of my sweet spot because my book, which came out in 2014, The Big Fat Surprise, the main argument in that book and really broke that story for media all over the world was saturated fats have been unfairly villainized and do not cause heart disease. I mean, I was in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I mean, that was the beginning of that story, which is for the first time, I put together all the evidence showing like the historical record doesn't support it, the clinical trial record doesn't support it, and I go really tell the story of Ansel Keys. So, him being, he's a pathologist, a physiologist, at the University of Minnesota, who proposed this theory that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease called the diet heart hypothesis. I wrote about President Eisenhower's heart attack in 1955, which really focuses the whole nation on the question of what causes heart disease. Really, nobody knew. There were a number of competing theories, like maybe it was vitamin deficiency, maybe it was the increasing amount of auto exhaust on the roads, maybe it was the type A personality where somebody just like runs around screaming at people and then has a heart attack. But into that vacuum of knowledge and information steps Ansel Keys and wins over doctors and others. He was a very aggressive personality. He would argue anyone to the death. I describe the ways in which he actually bullies other scientists who disagree with him. He's able to get onto the American Heart Association and swing the whole nutrition committee around in a single year to basically to support his idea. So the American Heart Association becomes the first group anywhere in the world recommending that people avoid saturated fat and dietary cholesterol and instead consume seed oils as a first measure of protection against heart disease. That was really the acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice we have today. And then I go on to describe how people around the world recognize that there really wasn't much evidence for this recommendation. There had been this very famous study called the 7-country study, but it wasn't even published yet. And that was a study that showed association only, not causation. Experts recognized the need for an intervention studies, clinical trials. So governments all over the world took up the call and launched huge, we couldn't even think about doing a trial this size today. Huge randomized controlled clinical trials in England, Australia, Norway, United States, looking at this hypothesis, Ansel Keys' hypothesis. So those experiments typically would feed one group more saturated fats. At the time, 18% of calories of saturated fats was considered normal. So that's what that group got. And the other group would get soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese, their equivalent of the Impossible Burger. And they would follow these groups. And, some of the experiments were quite long and followed thousands and thousands of people in the one funded by the NIH. It lasted 9 years. At the end of this, all these experiments concluded no effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So people didn't die earlier because they were having a high saturated fat diet. And the vast majority of them showed no effect on any kind of cardiovascular event. So heart attacks, strokes, whatever. An inconvenient finding that I surfaced in my book was that the folks on the vegetable oil diets died at significantly higher rates of cancer in 6 of those trials. And that was actually so concerning to the NIH that they had a series of high-level meetings throughout the 1980s. I mean, where Ansel Keys was invited, his colleagues were invited, and they were trying to figure out, like, why is it when people lower their cholesterol on these seed oils, do they die at higher rates of cancer? Ultimately, they couldn't figure it out, and they just said, well, reducing saturated fats is so important for heart disease, we're just going to sort of ignore those effects on cancer. So that's, clinical trial evidence. I mean, ultimately, some 76,000 people were tested on Ansel Keys' hypothesis, and the results were null, what we call null, meaning no results. And there has no hypothesis in the history of nutrition has been tested as much as the diet heart hypothesis, and yet they couldn't prove it to be true. And there's a saying in science, like if you throw a lot of money at a hypothesis and you can't prove it to be right, you're very likely wrong. But what happened? Those results were not absorbed by nutrition experts, by our policymakers, by any institution. Instead, and this is what I also documented and discovered, they were ignored. They went unpublished. The researchers who led them, in one case, in the most important study in the U.S., the Minnesota Coronary Survey, the lead researcher on that didn't even publish his results for 17 years, which, in science, not to share publicly funded data is a kind of lying. When he was asked why he didn't publish his results, he said, well, there was no problem in the way there's no problem in my study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. So the result was that these clinical trials were never absorbed in the nutrition literature, or they were misinterpreted. When I first encountered these trials, people would cite them, but as if they supported this hypothesis when they didn't. So they were misinterpreted or not cited, or and so if you don't mind my continuing with this story.
No, please do.
Okay, so fast forward to my book comes out, 2014. Gary Taubes's book had come out, Good Calories, Bad Calories, in 2007, I think. And his book was on a number of subjects. Mine was pretty laser focused on saturated fats. And a lot of researchers all over the world started waking up to the fact that, hey, we have these clinical trials, hard evidence on this hypothesis. Why do we not know about it? Why have they been buried for so long? So then we had, I would say, a renaissance in the scientific literature on saturated fats. From 2010 to today, there have been 24 systematic reviews and meta-analyses of these original trials. We call them the core trials. And nearly every single one of those systematic reviews has concluded that saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular total mortality and little to no effect on cardiovascular events. Saturated fats seem to lower people's risk of stroke. And therefore, there is zero evidence. There's insufficient evidence to continue our cap on saturated fats. This is based on the most rigorous data available in science. So randomized controlled clinical trials with hard outcomes. By that, I mean death and heart attacks are hard outcomes, not just intermediary markers like LDL and HDL, around which there's a lot of uncertainty and controversy. Hard outcome data. So, but what you see, I mean, this is an amazing thing to experience, but now, after this whole renaissance in scholarship, it is again being buried. It's a remarkable thing to see. I mean, the most recent decision by the World Health Organization on saturated fats completely ignores all the data on the hard outcome data from clinical trials and says saturated fats are a cause of heart disease. Our own US dietary guidelines committees, our USDA, we tried to submit this data to them. We submitted it in public comments. Researchers visited some of the leaders at USDA and HHS, and they completely ignored all the evidence. They just ignored it. So we have this problem where, the science is there, but we can't get it to our officials in charge, or we can't even get people in the field to recognize it. And that's just because, there are many reasons for that. It's because this is a longstanding policy. It would be an embarrassment of unknown proportions for the American Heart Association to admit it's wrong, the US government to admit it's wrong, for scientists across the world to admit they had invested their careers in supporting a hypothesis that turns out not to be supported by the evidence. So many people would have to, and official agencies and public health institutions would have to reverse themselves on a bedrock policy, perhaps the bedrock policy in nutrition for 60 years. I think that's a major reason why we haven't seen change or recognition of the science. And then, as you'll probably bring up, there's many corporate interests lined up with the vegetable oils, over saturated fats. Now we have the climate change argument in favor of not consuming animal foods. There's animal rights groups who are very active in this space. So there's just a whole confluence of different interests that are acting in this space that, let's just say as a whole, their interest is not human health.
How much of a piece of this do you think has to do with LDL? Because I'm sure the two of us would agree that when somebody switches to a diet we've been talking about today, likely their LDL is going to go up. And you mentioned the vegetable oils, and when people do include those, their LDL does go down. So we're not denying that part of this. The part of the LDL I think needs addressing and further testing, or just needs better surfacing of the research that's been done, is whether or not that is an issue when it comes to heart disease.
Well,
Because as long as we're associating and putting that at the cause of heart disease, people are going to push back against what we're talking about today.
so this is kind of a complex subject. One of the reasons that LDL is the favored heart disease risk factor is that there's a drug to treat it. The most financially rewarding drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry are statins. So they have a huge financial interest in keeping LDL cholesterol as the risk factor of choice. They tried and experimented trying to find a drug that would raise your HDL cholesterol, but they couldn't find one, or they found a drug, but it coincidentally made people sick and killed them. So they could not monetize that, commercialize it. So they're hyper-focused on elevating LDL cholesterol. I should say, even though large epidemiological studies have shown that its HDL cholesterol correlates much, much better with your heart attack risk than LDL cholesterol. It turns out that half the people who have heart attacks have low LDL cholesterol. There's really not much of a correlation there. But that science has been distorted over time. Again, I believe because there's such a financial interest in the LDL cholesterol. So let's just review a few issues here. One is that in all those core clinical trials I told you about, they did successfully many of them lower total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol by like 13% on average. And yet they saw no consequent benefit in cardiovascular risk. So it could be that, let's just say, for the sake of being generous, that lowering LDL cholesterol with a drug has some positive impact, but the same effect has not been seen in clinical trials with diet. I made this point in a debate with a famous cardiologist, and it sort of stopped him in his tracks. He said, you're right. This was on the radio. I couldn't believe it. So, and then he proceeded to go on and write an op-ed that I actually wrote it together. His name is Steve Nissen. It was called The Dietary Guidelines, an Evidence-Free Zone. But so that's one argument. And it's also been shown that the type of LDL cholesterol that goes up with the consumption of saturated fats is not. So there are various kinds of LDL particles, and it has been shown in intervention experiments that the ones that are related to heart disease are what's called the small dense LDL particles, and that the large buoyant LDL particles are not tied to heart disease. If anything, might be protective. Saturated fats raise the large buoyant LDL particle, not the small dense ones. So it's not the type of LDL that causes heart disease. That research has been known for decades, and yet the American Heart Association refuses to acknowledge it. And I know the person who did that research was the chair of the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee and tried to present the evidence, and nobody on his committee would even read it. So that's been known. The largest ever intervention trial that was the lead researcher on that was Dr. Sarah Hallberg, that was conducted at the University of Indiana, but was funded by Verta Health. They found that of the 23 risk factors that were measured on a ketogenic diet, 17 moved in the right direction. In other words, lowered your cardiovascular risks, like inflammatory markers, HDL, triglycerides, 17 markers in total. 2 of them didn't move at all. It wasn't good or bad. And the only thing that moved in the wrong direction was LDL cholesterol. So and the overall, what's called ACSVD, but your overall heart disease risk, it was reduced by 11 or 12%. So everything moves in the right direction except for LDL, and your overall cardiovascular risk goes down when you're on a ketogenic diet, when you look at all the cardiovascular risk factors. I mean, I could give you a couple more pieces of data. It was discovered that in a meta-analysis of 41 clinical trials, that the greatest determinant of what made your LDL go up if you were on a low-carb diet was not your consumption of saturated fat, but in fact your BMI, which is how fat you were. So that it was your level of obesity that was a greater determinant of your LDL. And finally, I'll just say that in people, there's something called a lean mass hyperresponder, which is our lean people who go on a very low carb diet and see their LDL go way up. I mean, really into what people consider the danger zone. And an experiment and an analysis by Dave Feldman and his colleagues that was published just this year, they found that where they did imaging of their arteries, they found that there was over a 5-year period, there was no increase in plaque, even though LDL had risen quite significantly. So, I mean, that I think should be enough data to give people some comfort. Like, whatever's happening with your LDL cholesterol, your overall cardiovascular risk is improving on this diet.
Let's talk more about the vegetable oil piece, because this does tie in nicely to what we're talking about. If somebody does incorporate those, their LDL will go down, like I mentioned before. But let's talk about the history of those, when they came on the scene, and why they're a bad idea for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. So I have to do a little tiny bit of self-promotion here, which is that my book was the first to really to put seed oils on the scene. Like, I actually brought the term seed oils from the rarefied world of seed oil scientists, oil chemists, they're called, whom I had spent like 2 years interviewing, brought that to the public attention. Also was the first really to sketch out their history, which was started, they really began to be produced as a byproduct of the cotton crop in the south of the United States. They started to crush cotton seeds into cottonseed oil. That was the first oil that was in large scale production, and they used that primarily as a lubricant for machinery because whale oil, which had previously been used to as a lubricant for the Industrial Revolution, in which there were so many more machines, needed so much more oil, but the whales were hunted out by the mid 1800s or so, and so cottonseed started to be produced, or maybe a little bit later, 1870s, started to replace whale oil for this lubrication use. Then in 1911, Procter and Gamble, one was a soap maker and the other was a candle maker, but those are both made from fats. They made this. They figured out the process of hydrogenation, whereby you could take an oil and harden it, because an oil, when it's just an oil, is very unstable and goes rancid quickly, and so they hardened it through this process of hydrogenation, and then they looked at this stuff that they had. They bleached it white, and they're like, well, it looks a lot like lard. So let's try to convince the American population, American housewives, that this substance should replace lard in their home kitchens. And they called it Crisco. And that there was a massive marketing campaign behind that. They were trying to convince women that these and American housewives are especially susceptible to this because many of them were immigrants, had left their grandmothers behind, and they wanted to assimilate and be modern. The modern thing was an oil or fat that was produced in industrial kitchens. None of the stench of the slaughterhouse. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, had come out right around then, and so people were disgusted with slaughterhouses. So this is not the fat of your grandmother at her spinning wheel. This is a new fat, modern and clean. And women, they leapt to it. So it was first marketed to Americans as Crisco, replacement of lard. Then there was the production of margarine in the 20s and 30s and 40s. It was cheaper than butter. And it was marketed as a product not just for poor people, but also in high-class kitchens. Margarine has a place even in wealthy homes. Those were the advertisements at the time. So margarine came to make huge inroads on butter. And then in the 40s, scientists discovered how to stabilize just regular oils, like very light hydrogenation, so that you could put oil in a bottle and sell it to housewives for frying. And this was Crisco oil, Mazola oil, canola oil, Mazola. And, I can't remember all the brands at the moment, but then those came onto the market. There's various ways in which these vegetable seed oils, they're more rightly called seed oils. And I should have said, we're talking about soybean, safflower, sunflower. Soybean is the major one used in America right now. They really received their major boost when the American Heart Association, as I mentioned, started to recommend them in 1961 instead of saturated fats. Well, I dug down into the history of the American Heart Association and discovered that in 1946, when it was kind of a nothing organization, because remember, heart disease was new and there weren't that many cardiologists yet, there was Procter and Gamble came and said, let's have a partnership and we'll make you the designated beneficiary of this Walking Man contest on the radio with Jack Benny. And according to their own history, which I somehow obtained, and I don't think there's ever been a copy available on the internet since, according to their own company history, that was the big bang of mega money for them, and into their coffers flew millions of dollars, and they were able to transform themselves, according to their own history, into a small, sleepy organization, into the national powerhouse that they are today. It was a huge boost to them. And not too many years later, here they are recommending that Americans consume vegetable oils over saturated fats. There's even a letter that I have from one scientist accusing the American Heart Association at the time, his name was Campbell Moses, of holding, and he says, how can you, he's like, that is just rank commercialism for you to be holding a bottle of Crisco oil in an advertisement. So there was clearly a lot of active promotion of these oils. The oils themselves marketed themselves as medical, like a kind of medicine, the kind of pharmaceutical. There's a full page Mazola ad that I reprint in my book, which says, take this page to your doctor to get a prescription for vegetable oils. There was a little book that was put out by Ansel Keys' colleague named Jeremiah Stamler, called, it's a little red leather book called Your Heart Has 9 Lives, where he advocates for vegetable oils, produced by the Corn Oil Association and distributed to thousands of doctors all over the United States. So there was just a real marriage of vegetable oil money and scientists to promote these oils. And, the fear of heart disease had many people switching over to those oils. And then there's, other events that happened in the 80s and 90s to further push Americans, greater fear of saturated fats, more and more unsaturated, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which I go into in my book. I mean, there's various different events. But what I discovered in my research was, first, those cancer effects that I told you about. They should be discussed more, because that is truly the only data we have from randomized controlled clinical trials on humans and their mortality effects, which are the most rigorous kind of outcomes. So I think it's fair to say seed oils cause cancer.
Do we know the physiology there?
Well, so let's discuss that when I talk about its other effects, which I discovered from an industry scientist. I was at a meeting and he said, well, you know about the toxic effects of seed oils, don't you? And I was like, no, do tell. And so in order to tell a story, I have to explain that when we got rid of trans fats are a byproduct of the hydrogenation process, right? So when we got rid of trans fats, we were getting rid of hydrogenation, or partial hydrogenation. But remember, hydrogenation had been found in order to stabilize these oils, right? Without the stabilization, they're unstable. So what does that mean? It means that if you pour a big thing of soybean oil into a vegetable fryer, which is what they had to do when they got rid of trans fats, and they're still doing presumably, you have this highly unstable oil. And especially in conditions of light but heat, especially, remember your high school scientific experiment, you have to heat things to speed up the reaction. They will oxidize, and they oxidize like crazy. I mean, every single one of those fatty acid molecules, which has multiple double bonds along it, those double bonds open up and they attach to oxygen. That's oxidation. And that is happening. There are hundreds of oxidation products that are produced as a result of heated oils. And those oxidation products include known toxins. So acrolein, which is the one that's found in cigarettes, and why some people say, seed oils is like smoking 8 cigarettes a day. And then the other big one that I discovered is aldehydes. So aldehydes are known toxins to cause heart disease and cancer. They're highly unstable, very, very hard to study. I was able to talk to a researcher before she retired at the University of Michigan, who was looking at these oxidation products in fast food restaurants around her campus. She discovered there are hundreds of these products in a piece of fried chicken alone, that those oxidation products enter into your bloodstream and you absorb them. And that they cross through the blood-brain barrier. So what does oxidation do? It drives massive inflammation in the body. So it's, this is yet to be shown in human experiments, but there are cases of people having body-wide sepsis and cancer as a result of consuming these polyunsaturated oils. There are two ones that are in most oils that are called linoleic and linolenic acid. Both of them, there's been a tendency sort of in this space to focus on linoleic, but linolenic is just as bad and equally prevalent. They have multiple double bonds, and those double bonds are what makes them unstable and subject to oxidation. So, I mean, just to give you a feeling for how real this is, this industry source I had, he said, you don't realize these oxidation and perioxidation products, they build up on worker uniforms in fast food joints. When those uniforms are placed in the back of trucks to take them to the dry cleaner, they spontaneously combust because those oxidation products are so unstable. They clean them, but they're still, when they put them in the dryers, they spontaneously combust in the dryers. So they had to develop, these chemicals were building up on the walls of the fast food joints like a shellac-like kind of substance, which, by the way, was also found in rat experiments, fed these oils. It's so disgusting to even say this, but they would find that their feces had this shellac-like substance that glued them to the bottom of the cage. So there had to be new cleaners invented to get the stuff off the walls. There was solutions in places like McDonald's and Burger King where they use nitrogen blankets on top of the fryers in order to prevent the fumes from getting out and building up on the walls. I should also say, we're also protecting the health of the workers who are breathing in these fumes. And in Asia, and in the Netherlands, there's a bunch of studies showing that especially women or fast food workers in enclosed spaces who are using these kinds of fryers have quite significantly higher rates of lung cancer. These fast food restaurants put silicone beads inside the oil itself to absorb the oxidation products. I mean, these oxidation products are real and recognized by the industry. And now people are waking up to it. And I feel really proud to have reported this. But and I'm really happy that we're now seeing people at a national level talking about seed oils. I think they should never have been recognized as sort of generally recognized as safe status in the United States for ingredients. And it's just clear to me these should never have been generally recognized as safe.
All right. So these oils oxidize easily, very unstable. How much of that oxidation occurs in use by the consumer? And then how much of it occurs as it's being made? Because the way I understand it, these oils go through quite a process before you even get the bottle.
Yeah.
So I can imagine there's a lot of oxidation pre-purchase and post. Do you know a lot about that?
I have actually visited a vegetable oil factory. And then the manager who allowed my visit begged me not to use it in my book because he said he would get fired. And so I relented. But I've been to one of those factories, so I can tell you what goes on there. They control for oxidation in that process, which has many, many steps. Because what comes out of pressing beans or seeds to make into oil is sort of a gray sludge. So it needs to be deodorized, winterized, bleached, stabilized, and then everything that you've taken out of it has to be then supplemented with color and vitamins and things that have been taken out of the oil. So it goes through maybe a 10-step process to be made, including the uses of a chemical chelate if you're doing hydrogenation. But I think those products they're not oxidized when delivered. I think that happens when oils are left out And, even things like nuts and seeds, which contain these same fatty acids, they're called omega-6 fatty acids. Nuts and seeds go rancid for the same reason. And they just go bad over time, even if there's no cooking or heat involved. But especially in cooking, there's just a massive speed up of the oxidation reactions.
Okay, we talked about trans fats, and the way I understand it, at this point in the US, I believe they're fully banned.
Yes.
But I know they can also be snuck in if they're below a certain percentage.
Under 0.5 grams
Okay,
is translated into 0 on the food label.
got it. So that's important. Talk about the grace period. I think there was a certain number of years when they decided to ban trans fats that they were still allowed to use them
Right.
as they're phasing them out. And then you confirm now they're banned other than that sneaky small percentage.
0.5 grams. But I would imagine most of the hydrogenation factories have been shut down. I mean, I haven't looked into that, but if you have a giant factory producing a substance that's banned, you're not going to keep that running. I like that would seem illogical to me. But one of the things that I covered in my book was like, what did industry? There was a huge panic in industry when the alarm went up about trans fats. There was a big effort to quash it. Like, of course, right? I spoke to scientists whose careers were ruined by what's called the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils, which is the trade group for vegetable oil manufacturers. And let's just understand who the players are here. Unilever, Bunge, ADM, Monsanto. I mean, these are huge, giant multinational companies. Their trade group hired scientists, some of whom I spoke to, who said it was their job to go and harass other scientists at conferences if they raised anything negative about vegetable oils. I mean, literally like stand up and harass them. I went to a vegetable oil conference where I saw this playing out with a Unilever scientist who just gave the person on stage such a hard time. One of the scientists I interviewed said, it just made you paranoid about your work. They would nitpick every single detail and you just became too afraid to even publish anything. And then he just got out of the field altogether. That's how you suppress any opposing science, right? So, but when they could no longer avoid, when these companies could no longer avoid the concerns raised about trans fats, which is a whole story in and of itself. But it was truly the biggest reformulation in the food industry in probably 50 years. I mean, it was huge because these oils, then hydrogenated, are in every packaged, bagged food product. If you go up and down the supermarket aisles, chips, cookies, crackers, everything has seed oils in it, all frozen foods. I mean, it's just in everything. And then suddenly they had to find alternative ingredient, that was just, the absolute bedrock ingredient in their industry. They were in a complete panic. I mean, I went to industry conferences where there was like stand after stand after stand. Okay, this is our low linolenic oil that we've made from genetically modified soybeans, and here's one that's a mix of palm oil, which is more stable, and other oils that were, here's our high oleic sunflower oil. Here's our interesterified oil, where we actually swap around on individual triglycerides. We swap around the fatty acids. I mean, there was just every kind of solution. But the problem was all those solutions were expensive. Changing each individual fatty acid, every single triglyceride is really, it was really expensive. So what most fast food companies did when I last checked in on them, they were just using plain old soybean oil with all the attendant worries and harms associated with that. So, there has been some move towards like, you can't put a product on a shelf that is just an oil because it's greasy. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't provide shelf stability. So you have to, now I think there's more, most products probably have a blend of some kind of more stable fat. Usually they like to use palm oil, which is not really an oil. It's more of a solid, very high in saturates. So yeah, it was a huge change for the industry, but I'm not sure that they're making products that are any healthier. I mean, what they should really do is just go back to whole natural animal fats, which is what used to be used in products. But they can't do that because of the cap on saturated fats, which prevents those fats from re-entering the food supply.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand the nuance here. So trans fats were banned. They had to pivot the whole industry, and chemical changes they would do or put different blends of oils together. But I still want to fully understand stability now with vegetable oils. Like if you go to the grocery store and you see the aisle where it has like all the different vegetable oils, I assume before, because of the hydrogenation or partial in that case, they were more stable. But now, if they're not doing that, how are those oils staying on the shelf?
That's a good question. I mean, previously, in order to put those oils on the shelf, they had to do something called touch hydrogenation, which was very light hydrogenation. So, the degree of more hydrogenation meant more solid. Like something that was highly hydrogenated would be like a chocolate coating or something. Something like an oil was using light touch hydrogenation, so very low in trans fats. The more hydrogenation, the more trans fats you produce. So it might be that level of the level of trans fats is enough to get under the label. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. It's a good question.
Okay. And you mentioned soybean oil, the pivot to using more of that in, I think it was fast food. So soybean oil is just generally more stable than some of the other seed oils?
No, it's just the cheapest, and it's in the United States, it's the cheapest oil, so it's used in most industrial settings. Like if you go look at your favorite restaurant and see what they put out in their garbage, it's usually gigantic cans of soybean oil.
So because they can't partially hydrogenate it, is it being changed up more frequently? Because it's obviously going to be going rancid quicker.
You do not detect that kind of rancidity in the flavor. So actually, no, there's no changeover required of restaurants in their oils. Ironically, it's the big chains like Burger King and McDonald's who have standards about changing over their oils more frequently because they're aware of the health risks on some level. It's probably your little mom and pop stir fry place or local Chinese restaurant that is using really old oils with ever increasing amounts of degradation products in them. And there's really no way to tell.
Right. So the difference before would have been because of the processing, it wouldn't have oxidized as easily. We're not tasting the difference, but likely the oils in these mom and pop restaurants are going to be worse for us than they were before.
Yes. I mean, that's the great irony about getting rid of trans fats. We thought that would improve the health of a nation, but I think the subheading in my book that I wrote is out of the frying pan into the fire. Like the oils that we are using now in these restaurants and in all our prepared food are far more dangerous.
But to be clear, you're still anti-trans fats for other reasons.
Yes. I mean, I don't believe there's any reason to consume seed oils. I think that, whether they're touch hydrogenated, more hydrogenated with trans fats or without trans fats, I don't think seed oils are doing anyone's health any favors at all. And so, I think we should return to whole natural fats, such as the ones that human beings used to eat and cook with for many, many millennia. And those were in the West, lard and tallow and suet. Those were the major fats that have been used.
Have you seen any data on use of these seed oils declining in recent years?
No.
Given information like your book being out there, and definitely in our world, it's being talked about quite a bit. It's almost on every podcast I do. We get into seed oils and vegetable oils. So hard to tell if it's hitting a broader array of people or if it's just within our niche. but definitely they're being talked about. And I'm wondering if that's affecting worldwide sales and
Yeah.
the amount of seed oils that are being made.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't looked into the data, but I mean, recently RFK Jr. said something about seed oils, and he has millions of followers. It's definitely, it's certainly on the public consciousness in a way that it never has been before. And maybe even companies are reformulating, and maybe there's some consideration about going back to natural fats. And there's definitely some food brands that have launched based on being seed oil free. Some restaurants are advertising being seed oil free. So, I hope this issue doesn't go away and that there will eventually be some action taken.
All right. So animal fats at the top, seed oils at the bottom, avoid those. What about in the middle? Things like coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil.
Yeah.
Some of these other oils from plants, but they seem to get a pass in our world.
Well, let's talk about olive oil first. So these other oils that we've been talking, the seed oils, are polyunsaturated fats. The poly means multiple double bonds. Saturated fats mean, which is, butter, lard. Oh, I forgot to mention butter being a major cooking fat for all millennia, many millennia. Saturated fats, animal fats, are saturated. Saturated means no double bonds because it's the molecule is saturated with hydrogens. Saturated fats are straight molecules like this. And they lay on top of each other, and that's why saturated fats, saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. The ones with multiple double bonds are all the double bonds kink the fatty acid chains, and they can't be close together, and that's why those are oils. So in between those is monounsaturated fats, mono being only one double bond. That means that there's less capacity for oxidation, only one double bond to open up and attach to oxygens. So when you look at the oxidation experiments that have been done in humans, and most of this work is done in humans, you see high oxidation in effects in polyunsaturated fats, almost no oxidation in saturated fats, and an in-between amount in olive oil. All of the main fatty acid in olive oil is called oleic acid. So that is the most stable of the oils. And that is why I think olive oil is good for using in cold applications like salad dressings. But I still wouldn't feel great about heating it because it will produce some oxidation products. So things like avocado and what was the other one you mentioned?
I mentioned avocado, olive, coconut.
Okay, so let's just say avocado. There is another one that's out there, but avocado is more like oleic. So a little bit lower, but it's still got multiple double bonds. I'm not really a fan of it. I mean, I still think that it's still multiple double bonds, and any of the double bonds can open up and attach to oxygen. Coconut oil really probably shouldn't be called oil because it's 89% saturated fatty acids. So, just to understand, like, all fats are a combination of different fatty acids, and coconut oil is let's just say 90% saturated. So it just tends to be a solid at room temperature, and that's a safe fat.
Let's bring palm oil in. Maybe that was the other one you were thinking of. You mentioned it earlier. There's controversy around it. And I know you've talked about that being something, I forget what group it was that was causing the controversy there. But there's also controversy when it comes to rainforests and the orangutans and destroying their habitat. So I'll have you talk about that one.
Yeah, there's environmental concern about the destruction of the habitat of orangutans in order to plant palm plantations. Palm plantations are mainly in Indonesia and Malaysia. There has been a big effort to keep palm oil and coconut oil out of the United States because they compete with our own domestic fats. And so there's various efforts that I described, like going back to the 50s, which were like anti-tropical oil legislation to keep out the competition. In the 1980s, there was an interesting twist. I mean, I actually traveled to Malaysia to go see a palm oil plantation and talk to the people who had been dealing with the science there. What they did is the U.S. still wanted to keep palm oil out. It's really quite useful for the ultra processed food industry. It's not really something that people consume individually much. So there was a whole campaign in the scientific literature where it was paid for by the American Soybean Association in large part to villainize palm and coconut oil. And it was a trade campaign, as I say. It was a trade campaign wrapped in a scientific, with a scientific veneer, right? So they used the science to malign tropical oils, and there was high-level meetings and summits, and I think it was resolved finally, and there was a deal that was struck in Hawaii at some hotel where they ultimately allow these oils to stay in the market, but they had suffered and been tarnished almost irreparably by this campaign, which had also led to another campaign by this this Omaha millionaire who thought he had saved himself from heart disease by eliminating all saturated fats from his diet. He puts out full-page advertisements in all major U.S. newspapers saying we have to get tropical oils out of all of our food. And there were pictures of all the different packaged foods with them, and it was Nabisco products and and others. And this triggered a barrage of phone calls into the Nabisco headquarters, such that they removed all of the saturated fats from their products, or I think they put in hydrogenated vegetable oils instead. So that was yet another boost to hydrogenated vegetable oils. But it really was about a trade war. There was a lot of turf. Soybean oil producers want their product to be sold in the United States, and they didn't want competition from foreign competitors. It's just a wild ride out there in the world of what you think is nutrition science.
There's a dark backstory, it seems, to all this.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, I am interested in nutrition science and reading all the science, but I really think it's important to pull back the curtain on some of the motives behind the science, because people don't understand that there are just many forces at work that are really not about health or about science. There are just many interests and even ideologies that are behind some of the studies and publications and that we see. And I think, it's fascinating to me. And I think that people enjoy understanding the backstory.
No, I definitely do. Let's talk about the good side of fats, or at least for most people, the way they look at them, which is the omega-3s. How do you look at those as part of a healthy diet?
Well, just relating it to the discussion that we just had about seed oils, there is this thing called the omega-3, omega-6 ratio. And which, if there's too many omega-6s, those are the seed oils, or even you can get them through nuts, a lot of peanut butter. If there's too many of those coming into your diet, they take the spot in this cell membrane and displace the omega-3s. So you are not getting the benefit of omega-3s if your diet has too many omega-6s. It's just, I talked to the foundational researcher in this field named Bill Land, and he said, the problem is you do not need to supplement with omega-3s. You just have to stop the tsunami of omega-6s that are coming into your diet. You can get sufficient omega-3s on a regular diet, even without fish, if you are not taking in all those omega-6s. So, I don't think omega-3 supplements are necessary. And they also have a problem of oxidation. They're the same multiple double bond fatty acid molecules as omega-6s. So they will go rancid, they will go bad, they will oxidize. You don't know if you're getting in that little capsule you're buying, you don't know if that's oxidized. Plus, I'm against them for sustainability reasons because the omega-3 factories, and I visited one in Peru, they go out and they troll for all the little fish, the sardines and other little fish, and they use that to make omega-3s. And those little fish are the foundation of the whole sea colony of life. They're what the birds eat, what the larger fish eat. And we've seen real collapses in those populations as a result of those little fish being just fished out of the waters. So, yeah, I don't think we should supplement with omega-3s. Also, there were large clinical trials trying to show a benefit from omega-3s in preventing heart disease, and they could not show a benefit from the omega-3 capsules. There may be some protective benefit from eating the fish itself, but you are not getting that benefit in omega-3 supplements.
So when it comes to you and the way you look at omega-3s for your body, are you just having fatty fish periodically to make sure you have that balance?
Yeah, I'd like to have like sardines or, I'll have like canned fish sometimes. I think that we don't see omega-3 deficits in people who are carnivore and not eating fish. So I'm not sure there may be enough omega-3s again in an environment with no omega-6s. You might just be fine with the amount that you can get from meat.
Talk more about your diet at this point. Somebody who's been knee deep in the research for years and years now.
Yeah.
Where's your diet at now? I know originally before you came into this world, you're a vegetarian for, I think, 25 years. So things have changed a lot.
Yeah.
Talk about that transition and where you're at today.
Yeah. I grew up in Berkeley, California, vegetarian for 25 years, no red meat, no butter, definitely no cream, maybe some cheese, and some eggs. But, and I gradually changed my mind. It was not like a sudden aha moment. I just gradually over time, I'm reading this research and I'm thinking, why do I believe what I believe again? I thought it was healthy, but all my research was pointing in the other direction. So I gradually started incorporating more animal foods in my diet. I still remember that first steak that I ever cooked. Like I didn't even know I only knew how to make vegetarian food. I was an excellent pizza and pasta maker. I made fantastic bread, but I had no idea how to grill a steak. And I felt guilty when I first put it on the counter. Like, you just have an aversion to red meat when you are a vegetarian for whatever reason. So it took me a while to switch over. And I would say that now I eat some vegetables and I am a cheater. Like I cheat sometimes. I live in a family who is not low carb, and there's just a lot of crap around the house that I can't avoid. And sometimes I will eat it. But in general, and I have to prepare meals for my family. But in general, we are eating meat or protein every night, and there's some vegetable usually alongside, so the plate doesn't look so bare. And that's and I eat twice a day, so that works for me.
When will you typically open that eating window?
Well, it's 2:00 here now, or almost 2:00 here on the East Coast, and I haven't eaten today, so that's pretty normal.
And you're doing that for health benefits or out of convenience, or how do you look at time restricted eating?
I guess it's just both. Like I don't enjoy dirty pans or having to deal with anything. So I just don't really want to bother eating. And I feel fine not eating. So I don't want to take time out of my day, but I do. Obviously I do when I get hungry. I'm not particularly hungry now, so it's fine. I don't have like hard set rules, and I don't feel, I'm happy to be flexible. And I don't have, to my knowledge, knock on wood, like any health issues. So, I feel like, I just feel like it works for me. And obviously I'm not like religiously dogmatic about it for other people. Like I have two young men, my sons, and I try to get them to eat. I try to say, like, prioritize protein, make that the start of your meal, and don't eat too much junk food. And if you do, eat at the end of your meal. And they're both, they're both pretty good. I feel like happy about that.
And you've already mentioned the fact that you're not a fan of omega-3 supplements.
Yeah.
Any other supplements that you take on a regular basis?
I take vitamin D3. I think that's the D I take because it's low. I have low vitamin D in my blood, and like I sit inside a lot of my day working. I just got this light lamp, but I don't think that delivers vitamin D. I'm not sure, but anyway, I like, and it's hideous. So, but I really don't take any supplements.
Do you include any organ meats?
No.
Just because you're not a fan, or
I mean,
how do you feel about health benefits?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not, I have had organ meats and I have had them. I tried like sneaking them into hamburgers and various kinds of food that I served, and everybody sniffed them out. So, and didn't like them and didn't like the taste. So I sort of gave up on that.
We talked about saturated fat before. We talked about cholesterol related to heart disease. But let's talk about dietary cholesterol, which often goes hand in hand with the saturated fat piece. And again, for people that are heading towards what we're recommending here today, from maybe more of a plant-based diet or higher carb diet, that would be, given the current status of the recommendations to people, that would be a legitimate concern. They would be worried about dietary cholesterol from what they've heard. So, rest their minds, talk about if there's any validity to fear around dietary cholesterol.
Well, first of all, I want to like impress upon you how everybody was paranoid of eggs in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, they were like a death food, and there was on the cover of Time magazine of like the 2 egg eyes and the bacon frown, like, do not eat, this diet will kill you. And I mean, I spoke to people who worked on the egg nutrition board, which was a trade group, and they were harassed, and it was more like bloody nutrition politics. By the end of the 70s, there had been an analysis done that said there doesn't seem to be any relationship in the amount of the dietary cholesterol that you eat and your blood cholesterol. And that's because it's what we call a homeostatic system. The more you eat, the less you produce, but you can produce it endogenously. So if your body will produce cholesterol, because body is essential in every organ in the body. It's essential for making hormones, especially sex hormones. It's essential for the functioning of the brain. You need cholesterol, and your body needs to be able to produce it if you're not eating it. So even people who there was an experiment of a Swiss scientist who ate like 40 eggs a day. This was recently replicated by Nick Norwitz, but it didn't cause his cholesterol to go up. This was known by the late 70s, but the folks invested in demonizing cholesterol were not backing down. So study after study, we can't find a relationship between dietary and blood cholesterol. Finally, in news that nobody's ever heard of because it was never publicized, 2013, in a scientific statement like that I stumbled on and just couldn't believe it was there. There's a single word in a table saying relationship between dietary and blood cholesterol. And there's a single word in that box saying insufficient, which they never talked about. They never released to the public. There was not enough evidence, but that was 2013. 2 years later, the American Dietary Guidelines Committee reviews the evidence and also finds insufficient evidence and barely communicates that to the public. They reviewed it again in 2020, I guess trying to find a different result. No relationship found. And again, barely, that news has barely been publicized at all. So, and the dietary guidelines still recommend dietary patterns that tend to be lower in cholesterol. That's all based on epidemiological evidence, which is far weaker than the clinical trial evidence that was reviewed for these decisions. So there are no more recommendations against dietary cholesterol. There aren't. We used to have a 200 milligram cap, or maybe it was 300. But anyway, we used to have a numeric cap. That is gone and has been gone for years. But again, getting back to this problem of why it's so hard to change nutrition guidelines to reflect the science, there is a real there's no desire or will or interest in flip-flopping on your public, and in changing recommendations. And it just, you lose your public if you admit you've been wrong on something so significant. So I think that's why these changes have not been publicized and people are still confused, unfortunately.
Really early on in the conversation, you gave us a framework for eating healthy when you went over your dietary recommendations there. And I want to come full circle before we part ways and talk about a piece that we haven't really addressed since then, which is dietary salt. And this is one that's controversial. A lot of people still fearing including that on top of their food.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what's going on there.
Yeah. We have a good overview of this on the Nutrition Coalition website, where if you go in, there's about the issue, there's something called Unsettled Science, and or the science is not settled. And we have a good page with all the links on sodium. So I've spoken to top sodium experts in the world, and there has been general an understanding that there's that a moderate amount of sodium is best. It's like a J-shaped curve. So if you have very high sodium, especially in people with hypertension, and it might be the hypertension itself and not the sodium, but high salt diets will increase the risk of heart disease and cardiovascular mortality. But if you go too low, you see the same problems. So really, it's a moderate amount is best. And one of the world's top salt experts, Yusuf Salim, he's done probably more work on this than anyone. And he said, look, the amount of your body knows what it wants, and you just salt to taste. And he's like, most people in the world are eating the same amounts of sodium. I think it's 3 to 5 milligrams a day. Like, everybody eats that because that's what the body needs and wants. And even if you put in measures to try to change that, people will somehow figure out how to get enough sodium in their diet because they need it. And then there was a National Academy of Sciences report on that came out in, I believe, 2013, which recognized that there was this conflicting science. But then the folks who are against sodium, which include the spice companies, because they benefit, it's two interests. One are the spice companies that benefit if sodium is low, then foods to taste better need more spices. So there was that commercial interest. But I think probably even more powerful are they're just anti-salt, I would say, zealots that are really invested in proving their hypothesis right. And these include some very, very prominent people. So those people got another report by the National Academy of Sciences saying actually lower is better. And that's the finding. The second finding, there was a whole lot of politics and who was on that panel. And Congress tried to intervene to make the panel more balanced. I mean, it's quite a story. But ultimately, is that second National Academy's report that was favored by the USDA Dietary Guideline Committee. And that's why we have lower is better for sodium, even though any effect that is potentially positive is only seen in hypertensive middle-aged adults. So there's no positive effect for anybody else, especially not children who are now getting tasteless meals without sodium in it. So there was a great Lancet editorial on this, where they basically said, the science is completely being ignored on sodium. And my friend, Salim Yusuf, he still says that scientists who work in this field are being harassed and they are being intimidated and their research funding is being pulled and they can't get their studies funded. So it's just yet another politicized area of science, unfortunately. So I think people should, like, my sense is people should salt to taste. There's some controversy in the carnivore world now about whether you need to add extra salt to the diet. Some people experience IBS symptoms with that. That's not like it's kind of niche area that I don't know a lot about, but I know there's some discussion about salt amongst carnivores. But in general, most people should just add salt as needed and trust your body.
How do you feel about all these different types of salt? Pink Himalayan, regular sea salt, table salt. Do you feel it matters?
I don't know. And I'm willing to believe that a higher quality salt would be better. But we are starting, because people are table salt is iodized and you need iodine in your diet. And we are starting to see more iodine deficiencies with people going off table salt. So I just would insert that as a like a note of caution for people who are using other kinds of salt. And I don't know what the solution is.
Nina, thank you for coming on the show again. I really appreciate this, coming on and dispelling all these different myths around nutrition. The work you're doing is so important. So keep doing what you're doing. We're going to link up your book, your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. It's finally nice to spend time. It's finally that we got to spend time with each other after trying to plan this for so long. I think I'm now getting tired and my words are coming out all twisted. But I just wanted to put in a plug. I have a column on called Unsettled Science on a platform called Substack. And that is currently how you can read and support my work now.
We're going to link that up.
Okay.
Thanks again, Nina.
Thank you.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Towards the end of college, I started developing GI upset with basically anything I ate. So I ended up becoming quite desperate, and after trying a bunch of medications that didn't end up really working to keep me in remission or help my symptoms, tried a bunch of different diets.